Hello, my name is Sarah Jane Haney. Welcome to my EDL 850 Module 12 case study. Section 1 focused on summarizing and evaluating the case. Who might be involved includes Keith Sample, Mrs. Lynn, Mrs. Williams, all teachers at St. Regis, Mrs. Brandon, the PTA, the superintendent, and the district school board. So when did this occur? This incident occurred about 4 months after receiving the software programs. It occurred at St. Regis School. So what didn't happen? Mr. Sample was not consulted about the copies prior to them being made and distributed. Mrs. Lynn was not made aware of the copyright laws and district policies according to what I read through the case. So what did exactly happen? The part-time computer assistant, Mrs. Lynn, was hired on as a full-time computer and library assistant. Mrs. Lynn ordered new software programs for use in the computer lab. Teachers asked Mrs. Lynn to copy the new software programs to be installed on the computers in the classrooms. Mrs. Lynn made multiple copies and distributed them to teachers. Mrs. Brandon approached Mr. Sample about the illegal copies. Mr. Sample told Mrs. Lynn to gather the copies and stop making additional copies, and Mrs. Lynn argued the case for continuing to make the copies. I'll go a little bit more into depth about who is involved or might be involved later on in this presentation. So evaluating legal and ethical issues. Some of the legal issues: there's a potential for the district to be harmed by Mrs. Lynn's decision to make copies of copyrighted programs. The district, school, and Mrs. Lynn may face legal consequences for Mrs. Lynn's actions. The actions taken violates the 1976 Copyright Act and the Software Licensing Agreement. It is likely Mrs. Lynn broke the contract by going against the district Internet Acceptable Use Policy. Ethical issues: if the copies are continued to be made, Mrs. Lynn, other staff, and Mr. Sample are aware that they are violating the licensing agreements, which could result in interference with the current and future success of students and teachers. This violation could also impact the well-being of the teachers. Section 3 focused on communicating a synthesis of what happened. Mrs. Lynn has violated the software copyright policies under the direct supervision of Mr. Sample by copying and distributing the new software programs to other staff members. Section 4 focuses on a reflective evaluation of the facts, so going a little bit more into those details. So the people: Keith Sample, who is the principal of St. Regis School, and in this case I am presenting as Mr. Keith Sample. Mrs. Lynn, who is the full-time computer/library assistant. She made and distributed copies of the new software programs. Mrs. Williams, the third grade teacher, who received a copy of the software programs from Mrs. Lynn. Mrs. Brandon, who is also a third grade teacher, who was offered the software programs copy from Mrs. Lynn and reported the issue to Mr. Sample. St. Regis school staff includes others that received and are using the software programs from Mrs. Lynn, and the PTA, who are providing the funds for the new software programs. So additional people with unknown involvement include the parents and community members providing the donations through school fundraisers, the superintendent, and district school board members. So a little bit about the program. It is a K-8 school with about 420 students, which is about 2 students per grade, or 2 teachers per grade level. There are 2 major fundraising efforts each year for financial support, which is collected through the PTA. The place is St. Regis School. It's in a rural area about 25 miles from a large city. So Section 5 focuses on reflectively evaluating and prioritizing the information. So a little bit about the stakeholders. The individuals that have important stake in the outcome include the teachers, district administration, the school board, parents, and community members, and the students. The situation could be damaging to the stakeholders because legal action could be taken against the school district, building administration, and Mrs. Lynn. Not all stakeholders, as far as I'm concerned, have been consulted. District administration, the school board, and the PTA has not been made aware of the situation. I believe I could learn more about Mrs. Lynn's contract and the district policies regarding internet acceptable use. Based off the information I have been provided, I believe I can make a decision that creates the best possible outcome for all the stakeholders involved. Section 6 focuses on identifying ways to improve and develop a plan. So the first option is to take no action. This would be to continue letting Mrs. Lynn make copies and distributing copies of the copyrighted software programs. Option 2 is a more liberal action, which includes collecting all copies of the software programs and dismissing Mrs. Lynn from her position as a full-time computer and library assistant, and providing the superintendent with a report of what has occurred. I would also provide training to all the staff on district policies, procedures, regulations, and laws associated with copyrighted materials. Option 3. The third option is to collect all copies of the software programs and inform Mrs. Lynn of the responsibilities she has to follow district policies and procedures associated with copyrighted material. Mrs. Lynn will receive a warning for this violation. I will also provide training to all staff of the policies, procedures, regulations, and laws associated with copyrighted materials. I will follow up frequently with teachers to ensure that the policies, procedures, laws, and regulations are being followed. Section 7 focuses on reflectively evaluating the options. So the option 1 pros include that more teachers are able to use the software programs in their classrooms, even though it is illegal. Option 1 cons include that the school district, Mrs. Lynn and Mr. Sample, are at risk for being reported for making these copies. There could be legal consequences for Mrs. Lynn's actions. Mr. Sample is turning a blind eye to illegal and unethical actions made by Mrs. Lynn, and district policies and procedures may not be being followed. Option 2 pros include that illegal copies are collected and disposed of. Staff receives relevant and training to avoid future issues. Mr. Sample addresses the behavior which has a positive impact on the district and staff, and the district avoids legal consequences. Option 2 cons include that Mrs. Lynn doesn't receive a learning opportunity. Option 3 pros include that staff, including Mrs. Lynn, will receive relevant training. Illegal copies are collected and disposed of, and the district avoids facing legal consequences. Option 3 cons include that Mrs. Lynn may continue to make copies despite warning and training. Section 8 focuses on developing the best plan. The plan I would implement would be option 3. Option 3 provides a learning opportunity for all staff, including Mrs. Lynn, which will promote the current and future success and well-being of each student and adult. This decision was implemented because it provided the most reasonable actions that provide the greatest care and attention to students as well as staff. Through this option, all necessary stakeholders will take part in the implementation of this decision to ensure all policies, procedures, regulations, and laws are being followed within the school district. Why educating staff is important. According to Gallagher, in the past, copyright laws knowledge was most important for media professionals to be aware of, but with increased opportunity to view and share work digitally, it is important for all individuals to understand individual responsibility associated with copyright laws. The Section 9 focused on implementing the chosen plan. Implementation. The first step in the implementation of this plan would be to collect all copies of the software programs. Once copies have been collected, I would share the incident with the superintendent to ensure they know the situation and are aware prior to educating staff. Next, I would inform Mrs. Lynn that copies of copyrighted material is not okay and that if it occurs again, there will be severe consequences such as termination. After that, Mrs. Lynn and the other staff members will receive training on the policies, laws, and regulations of copyrighted materials, as well as the procedures associated with reporting illegal behavior in regards to copyrighted materials. After all of these actions have been taken, as principal, I will continue to monitor and follow up with staff members to ensure the policies, procedures, laws, and regulations are being followed within the school. If Plan A, if this plan does not work, Plan B would be implemented, which would be to go back to option 2 and dismiss Mrs. Lynn from her position, but continue to share that training with other staff members. Some of the likely outcomes out of my option 3 choice would be that Mrs. Lynn complies with providing the copies and undergoes the training and does not make any more copies of the copyrighted software. Or staff members learn the expectation for copyrighted materials and reports if there are any future issues. Mrs. Lynn does not stop making copies of copyrighted materials. If that is the case, we would go to Plan B. The superintendent would like a different plan to be implemented, and if that is the case, I would also suggest Plan B. So dealing with the persons involved. Those needing to be informed of the plan include the principal, school board, staff members, and Mrs. Lynn. Due to the fact this could create legal issues, this situation must be handled in a formal manner by including the superintendent and possibly the school board. Section 10 focuses on the current and future implementation statements that I learned through this assignment. So our standard correlation, my assignment demonstrates correlation to standard 6 because I was able to evaluate, develop, and demonstrate the ability to promote current and future success and well-being of each student and adult by applying what I have learned through this course to improve management, communication, technology, school-level governance, and operation systems to improve resource plans to apply laws, policies, regulations, and procedures. Relevant. This assignment was relevant to my current learning because as a future building leader, I need to be prepared to ensure laws, policies, regulations, and procedures are being followed to promote current and future success of students and staff. As a current educator, this assignment will have an impact in the decisions I make to ensure I am following district and state laws, policies, and regulations associated with copyrighted materials. I will also be able to help other teachers to understand their roles and responsibilities with copyrighted works. So the reflection, this assignment will impact the decisions I make as a future building leader in many ways. One way is that I feel more prepared to evaluate and make comprehensive decisions that will make a positive impact on student and adult success and well-being. I will also be able to communicate the laws, policies, regulations, and procedures associated with copyrighted materials to staff members to ensure my building and district are both legal and ethical in making ethical decisions to improve student learning. Thank you so much for watching. This is my reference slide as well. Take care.